Imprisoned, Chapter 2, Hysteria. It had been more than 4 decades since the first wave of Japanese immigrants had come to America seeking new opportunities. By 1941, the poor but peaceful country from which they had emigrated was a much different nation from the one they had left behind. Now ruled by military leaders intent on making it a world power, Japanese had begun seizing French, British, and Dutch possessions in Asia. Determined to prevent the United States from interfering with its warlike actions, on December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, where the heart of the United States naval fleet was lined up, lying at anchor. Early that morning, 183 Japanese dive bombers suddenly appeared and zoomed down on the unsuspecting ships and their crews. 8 American battleships, some carrying as many as 3,000 men, were sunk or severely damaged, and 13 other vessels were put out of action. Some 180 American fighter planes were also destroyed before they could get off the ground. As one eyewitness to the attack stated, quote, "It was awful, for great ships were dying before my eyes. Strangely enough, at first I didn't realize that men were dying too." American servicemen were killed in horrifying numbers. By the time the sneak attack was over, more than 2,300 had lost their lives, and as close as 1,200 others had been wounded. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, calling December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, asked Congress to declare war on Japan. Congress agreed by a vote of 470 to 1, with Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin of Montana the lone naysayer. For Japanese Americans in particular, the attack on Pearl Harbor had consequences far beyond plunging the United States into war. The devastating surprise assault instilled the notion of Japanese treachery in the minds of Americans and set the stage for one of the most disturbing periods in the nation's history. The anti-Japanese American feelings that immediately followed this attack resulted in what more than 4 decades of racial prejudice and discrimination had failed to achieve: the removal of all those of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. As soon as the events at Pearl Harbor were made known to the public, many residents of California, Oregon, Washington, and their neighboring states reacted with what can best be described as hysteria. Much of this hysteria was aimed at the Japanese American population. Quote, "I used to run back and forth to school with friends," Sato Hashizumi recalled, "and some of them would begin to say, 'Are you a Jap?' I would say, 'No, I'm not a Jap, I'm Japanese.' Then they would chase me or throw things at me and say, 'Go back where you belong.'" Lily Sasaki had similar humiliating and even frightening experiences. Right after December 7th, she recalled, "Wherever I went, I felt so self-conscious and embarrassed. I went to the library once, and this handsome woman, about 50, in a pretty dress, gray-haired, tall, looked at me and stuck her tongue out. I couldn't believe it. Then on the bus in Los Angeles, I heard 2 women in front of me. They knew I could hear. They were saying, 'One thing is certain, we should get all the Japs, line them along the Pacific Ocean, and shoot them.'" Words like those began to strike terror in the hearts of many Japanese Americans. My mother, Chisu Oyami, later said, "They're going to kill us." I said, "Oh, Mama, we live in America. They're not going to kill us." She says, "Well, they're going to put us in slave labor." The new attacks on those of Japanese ancestry were based more than longtime anti-Japanese American feelings. Much of the hysteria arose out of widespread fear that Japan would follow up the Pearl Harbor assault with an invasion of the West Coast. And many believed that if that took place, Japanese Americans would be certain to come to the aid of their ancestral country. No matter that most at this point were American citizens, no matter that they had repeatedly declared how proud they were of this fact, they were not to be trusted. Their true loyalty had to lie with Japan. They were bound to aid Japan in its imminent invasion. Once a Jap, always a Jap, Congressman John Rankin declared. The Los Angeles Times was even more specific in raising the specter of Japanese Americans aiding the enemy. The day after Pearl Harbor, it set out the call for, quote, alert, keen-eyed citizens who could be of yeoman service in cooperating with the military authorities against Japanese American spies and saboteurs. We have thousands of Japanese here. Some, perhaps many, are good Americans. What the rest may be, we do not know, nor can we take a chance, in the light of yesterday's demonstration that treachery and double-dealing are major Japanese weapons. Los Angeles' Mayor Fletcher Beaurun went even further in alerting his constituents against those of Japanese ancestry. Right here in our own city, he warned, are those who may spring into action at an appointed time in accordance with a prearranged plan wherein each of our little Japanese friends will know his part in the event of any possible attempted invasion or air raid. Then the rumors started. Japanese Americans had known about the Pearl Harbor bombing before it had taken place and had been seen the night before planning a secret victory celebration. They were sending radio signals to Japanese submarines lurking in the waters off the west coast. They were plotting to poison Los Angeles' and San Francisco's water supplies. They were about to block the roads in all major West Coast cities and were conspiring to blow up dams and bridges. Adding to all these rumors was the release of a report on the Pearl Harbor attack by a committee of inquiry headed by Supreme Court Justice Owen J. Roberts. The outrage at Pearl Harbor, the report stated, was immeasurably aided by Japanese American spies. The fact that not one of these rumors and allegations was true and that not a single shred of evidence was ever uncovered to substantiate them did nothing to diminish the assault on Japanese Americans. Thanks to the West Coast newspapers, the attacks not only increased, but also became more vicious. Quote, a viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched, a Los Angeles Times editorial declared. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents, nurtured upon Japanese traditions, living in a transplanted Japanese atmosphere, notwithstanding his nominal brand of accidental citizenship, almost inevitably, and with the rarest exceptions, grows up to be a Japanese, and not an American. Thus, while it might cause injustice to a few to treat them all as potential enemies, I cannot escape the conclusion that such treatment should be accorded to each and all of them while we are at war with their race. Venomous words, but actually mild in comparison to others that were being publicly uttered. A good solution to the Jap problem in Idaho and the nation would be to send them all back to Japan, then sink the island, Idaho's Governor Chase Clark proposed to a large audience. We don't want them buying land and becoming permanently located in our state. It was a frightening suggestion, but, as Congressman Mel Levine would later note, frightened people do frightening things. And soon another type of solution was being proposed. I am for the immediate removal of every Japanese to a point deep in the interior, wrote syndicated columnist Henry McLemore. I don't mean a nice part of the interior either. Let them be pinched, hurt, hungry, and dead up against it. But tragically for the Japanese Americans, it was quickly embraced by others, including many in high places, such as Congressman Rankin. Little more than a month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the push for the removal of the Japanese Americans was on in earnest, and as it rapidly gained momentum, its supporters reached for every reason they could conjure up to justify what they were proposing. Mayor Beaurun even invoked the name of Abraham Lincoln. If Lincoln were alive, Beaurun told a radio audience, he would most certainly deal harshly with the Japanese Americans. Quote, there isn't a shadow of a doubt, Beaurun concluded, but that Lincoln, the mild-mannered man whose memory we regard with almost saint-like reverence, would make short work of rounding up the Japanese and putting them where they could do no harm. Of all those who called for the evacuation and internment of Japanese Americans, no one played a larger role or had more influence than General John L. DeWitt, commander of the U.S. Army's Western Defense Command. Unfortunately for those of Japanese ancestry, DeWitt, who with the declaration of war had been given supreme West Coast military authority, was a man who harbored deep, racially motivated anti-Japanese American feelings. And he was determined to use his authority to see to it that all those who had even one drop of Japanese blood in them were forcibly removed from the West Coast states, he hoped forever. Immediately after Pearl Harbor, DeWitt became the strongest voice in convincing many government leaders that a Japanese attack on the mainland was imminent and that West Coast Japanese Americans were committed to aiding in the attack. The Japanese race is an enemy race, DeWitt proclaimed, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on United States soil, possessed of United States citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. It, therefore, follows that along the vital Pacific coast, over 112,000 potential enemies of Japanese extraction are at large today. Even after it became clear that every rumor of Japanese American sabotage or espionage had proven false, DeWitt, in what can only be described as an outrageously far-fetched argument, continued his attack, declaring that, quote, "The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken." Day by day, DeWitt stepped up his assault on West Coast Japanese residents. Week by week, his words became more and more inflammatory. "A Jap's a Jap," he continually stated to the newspapers. "We must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map," he testified to Congress. Just as he had become the leading voice in raising fears about Japanese American sabotage and espionage, DeWitt became the most vocal and powerful figure in the movement to rid the West Coast of all those of Japanese ancestry and place them in detention camps for the duration of the war.